Not too long ago, I uploaded a video about a retro emulation console that came with over 114,000 games and was being sold on Amazon. It was called the High Avenir Kinhank Super Console X3 Plus. Yeah, it's a mouthful. It was an interesting little setup, but it had some issues that seemed common with these types of devices. So after that video started to gain some traction, wound up getting a ton of views, the company that sells it hit me up saying, hey, we created a new version that was improved over the previous one that I reviewed. So of course I was interested. And that's where we're at. So today we're going to be taking a look at this new version. Instead of the High Avenir branding, this one says Bearway. I don't know why. And like the other that is available on Amazon that I reviewed, it's being sold for the same exact price. So unboxing this thing, I don't want to focus too much on that because it came with all the same items as the other version, including the Just OK PS2 style wireless controllers. So I did reach out to them trying to figure out what was improved or upgraded. And all they said was, and literally this is what they said, just straight to the point, smoother operation, better cooling, and updated some technical issues. That was the email. That was all they said. Exactly what they said. I mean, I guess we'll have to find out. So after I booted this thing up and I started exploring the UI, I didn't see any immediate differences. The same 68 consoles are listed, so I went back to compare with the previous one, and the number of games for each console are identical. So what has changed? The actual console is the same, just different branding. It's using the same chipset, the same specs, the same fan, and the fan does work well, but I don't know with the smoother operation, better cooling, updated tech issues, like what's really going on. It's a little confusing. So I went back and I double checked all the stuff that I tested on the first one and, played them again on this one. And I noticed stuff like Need for Speed on the 3DO still boots up with some weird Japanese dating game. So I guess they didn't catch that. Performance on games that I previously tested were all the same. And the issues with duplicates, they're all still present for all the popular consoles like NES, Super Nintendo, Genesis, and Game Boy. The ROM hacks are still separate in their own categories, so that's a good thing. But what the hell is really going on here? I'm not finding anything that has changed, and unless it's just so small or well hidden, I'm just not noticing it. But either way, I guess I'll take this opportunity to test, stuff on here that I didn't test on the first video, making this more of like a follow-up, I suppose. I'll have a link down below for the previous video on the first one that I reviewed, if you haven't seen it yet, so you can go back and see all the stuff I tested there, because it's identical for this, but I'm not testing the same stuff today. So I'm not going to waste too much time on things we know will work, like your 8 and 16-bit stuff is all fine. You won't find issues with things on NES, Super Nintendo, Genesis, all the old handhelds, or even PlayStation 1. So I wanted to focus on a few things that I didn't really look too much into the last time. And with this build, there are thousands of arcade games on it, and I didn't really go through that too much in the previous video, as going through the list, it just seemed like tons of stuff that normally work without issue. But this time, after I tested out a bunch of games in MAME and Final Burn Alpha, I did randomly find a game here and there that I don't normally have issues with, just not loading up at all. So this could be due to any number of issues. And if you feel like it, you can change what emulator you are using for arcade stuff, and that may fix the problem. But yeah, out of the box, there is no way to tell with how many games in the arcade section there is on what will run properly without actually trying every single one. And that would take an unreasonable amount of time. It's probably just the wrong ROM set for whatever emulator they have as default. But moving on. I tried out some of the 81 Amiga CD games they have on here, and some ran just fine, but I did find a handful of games that either wouldn't run or they would crash after, starting the game. They would just be on a screen and like a gray or black screen making a bunch of crazy noises. So yeah, hit and miss. A lot of this stuff's going to be hit and miss. Now, a Thomas Wave, Dreamcast, and Naomi, which I did test the previous time, it's typically a mixed bag with all that stuff, but I went back and tried a few more games. Dolphin Blue seems to run well, and a lot of times that game, it will run on these types of devices, but I've noticed most of the time this game will have like some minor graphics glitches, but here I didn't have any of those problems, so that's a plus. And then on Dreamcast, they do have a bit over 20 games included, and some I know run a little sluggish, but this time I tried Marvel vs. Capcom 2, and hey, surprisingly, no issues. Graphics were fine and no performance problems. A lot of times this game, I'll wind up having some little minor graphics glitches, but here it was good. Oh, and I did notice on my previous video, some people were asking if the build had TurboGrafx 16 games on it, and yes, it does. They're listed in the PC Engine system, which is the Japanese version if you're not aware. It has all regions living together there, so you will see a small number of duplicates as the TurboGrafx 16 had less than 100 games officially released for it in the US. Oh, and I did notice Super Graphics is listed here, but with a buttload of games, which is odd. That system only had 5 games released for it, so hundreds of duplicates from the PC Engine are listed here. And I'm sure you're seeing a trend. This thing has over 114,000 games on it, but how many are duplicates? So what is the real number, right? Now, moving on, I went back to Sega Saturn. I wanted to try out a couple more games. They only included 14 games with the Saturn, and they seem to be lesser demanding stuff for the most part, which I initially thought maybe they would all work okay as they're mostly just 2D games. But you will find a game or two in this list that has slowdown. Street Fighter Alpha is unplayable, but then you go to Mortal Kombat Trilogy and it seemed to play fine. Now, I don't normally focus on the ports section, but this time I did want to check out what they included. There's lots of cool stuff here. Now, one thing you may notice is Outrun is listed as Cannonball, and this may seem weird to some people at first, but Cannonball is actually a Outrun game engine, so having it listed that way is fine, but it would have, if they changed the name to Outrun, maybe it wouldn't be as confusing. But I did play a few of these games, and they all seem to run well within the ports section. Now, I also returned to Nintendo 64 to check out a few games, as it's always hit and miss with the system on these devices. Some games run great, others not so much. So this time I played Blast Corps for a bit, and it seemed to run well, but it did have some minor graphics glitches on occasion, mostly within the UI and other elements in the game. Now, Cruisin' USA is a glitch fest and runs extremely slow. I don't know why it's always that one that runs like that, and the other 2 Cruisin' games typically run okay. But I did, try the other, one of the other Cruisin' games and a few other games, and I would get an error and they wouldn't boot. That's just a handful of games here and there, but yeah, some of them in the Nintendo 64 would give me an error for whatever reason. Now, I did check out a few other less demanding systems that I didn't go into detail in the last video, like 32X. It runs fine, but the game list has both Japanese and US ROMs mixed together. That's not the biggest issue for such a small library, but with other systems like Super Nintendo or Genesis, it gets a bit chaotic scrolling through the list of duplicate games from every region. Like one game you'll have like 5 versions of. Gets a little too much, a little more organization would have been appreciated. Now, we also have a Pokemon Mini on this thing, and it's usually something I overlook, but finally I wanted to check it out, as I do remember having this thing back in the day. It was kind of neat, mostly a novelty, but the games for Pokemon Mini, they run perfectly fine here. But I did notice by default, bezels are on with this system, and with the bezels, it does cover the gameplay area with Pokemon Mini games. So I turned that off in RetroArch, which you can access by pressing Select and Y on the included controller. Now, every game I tried on Nintendo DS ran well, which isn't surprising, but with this, it's not really set up with the hotkeys, so you may want to check that stuff out in Drastic and to be able to like change how the gameplay screen is shown, to put priority on one or the other, move them around, that kind of thing. And you should be able to get into that menu by pressing the L2 button on the controller. Now, I also quickly checked out Virtual Boy, and no surprise, it runs fine here, but yeah, to each their own if you actually care about Virtual Boy. But it is interesting to play a few of these games. Now, another system I usually bypass is Game & Watch. And here you have a lot of interesting stuff. LCD handheld games from Nintendo and companies like Coleco. And these run fine, but sometimes it seems like some of the games lock up if you press the wrong button. Now, if you press and hold the start button, an overlay will come up showing you what the controller buttons do. So that's a good thing. And then pressing select, you could swap the full screen. Just some tips here and there to help you out. So overall, after having spent more time with this supposed upgraded version, I do stand by my initial thoughts on the first one. It's a fairly decent setup, not the worst I've ever seen, but it would have been nice if they put more effort into it, getting it organized, presentable. You know, it's always this like more games, the better type of thing. But how much of this stuff are you actually going to play? There's some systems here that have like 20, 30,000 games listed. There's no way anybody's going to play that stuff. It's just crazy. Arcade stuff, duplicates. All the main consoles, duplicates out the ass. You're going to find a lot of sloppiness here with the organization. Screenshots for games in the UI are going to be incorrect or missing for, games here and there. Just fairly random. And like I did say, this is not the worst offender at all, but I'm still waiting. I'm waiting to see one of these do it well enough for me to actually say this is the one I'd recommend if you don't want to make your own setup. But yeah, I'm still waiting. Do appreciate you guys watching. Catch you on the next one. Bye.